Hi, everyone. Welcome to Blockchain Value Conversation. Today, we have a special guest, and we're going to be talking about what's going to be happening in 2022. So we will be making predictions. And before we make predictions, let me give you some instructions, because we are talking about crypto and blockchain. And yes, some folks invest in this, but this conversation is not to give you legal advice or investment advice. This conversation is really for entertainment purposes only. So do enjoy it. And if you choose or consider to invest, do your research, talk to professionals, make sure you do not invest your last hard-earned dollars. So definitely, before you do anything, consult and with professionals and do some independent thinking. But most definitely also enjoy this conversation, because I have a very special guest today, Miko Matsumura, and I will let Miko introduce himself because he knows himself much better than I know him, although I'm a huge admirer. Miko, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Olga. So my name is Miko, and I'm a general partner with Gumi Cryptos Capital, which is a venture capital firm. We've been operating our fund for about 4 years now. And, we did make a number of very early stage investments. We do DeFi and CeFi. We invested in Celsius Network, OpenSea, which recently raised substantial rounds. Also YGG, Yield Guild Games, and a number of other DeFi, CeFi, and infrastructure projects. One of our recent ones actually is Agoric. I'm wearing the Agoric hoodie, and I think that one's been pretty exciting as well. So, we continue to, look for exciting startups, and, we go very early stage to invest in, the future of blockchain.
Oh, I love it. Yes, OpenSea did really well recently. It's almost mind blowing how well. It's been fun to see those guys grow up. I'm gonna start a little bit more from the beginning, just because I think folks will be interested to know how what you did before blockchain crypto, how you got into it, and why you get up in the morning excited to do more of it.
Yeah, so I'm happy to be on a show called Blockchain Value, because I come from developer relations, so really from developer tools. So I got my start it's been almost 30 years since the birth of the Java language and platform. So my first kind of meaningful role here in Silicon Valley was working as a chief Java evangelist. So really developer and platform relations. I've been working on a number of startups in the open source software domain, including Hazelcast, which is an in-memory database, things like Gradle, which is build automation software, principally for Java, but now being used across lots of different programming language environments, and things like mobile cloud services. So lots and lots of developer tools. So that's been my kind of passion.
And what was the event that inspired you to do crypto?
Yeah, so I was working on an in-memory database called Hazelcast, and my friend, who was actually the founder of Hazelcast, basically called me up and said, "Wow, I've been studying Bitcoin, and he actually went all the way to kind of the heart of Bitcoin, which is he sort of built his own implementation of the Bitcoin protocol just to see how it worked. And, he got very excited about it. And, he started, excitedly teaching me, all about it. So, we actually worked together on a project. But, after I started seeing the potential, I was definitely hooked.
Well, I think that is a story that is true for many of us. One excited friend that makes you excited for life, right? You did some pivots into actual investing. And I'm just curious, how did that pivot come about? Because, you were on the business side of sort of selling developer tools, which is, let's just say a very geeky, narrow niche, to now building and being kind of in the center of this, DeFi, CeFi all of the stuff that is going on. As an investor, that's a very different role. How did that happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like it's a combination of things, but one of them is really thinking hard about my sort of career, right? And so I got my start in developer evangelism, right? So evangelism really means kind of this idea of spreading the good news, right? So it has a religious connotation, and it kind of borrows from Guy Kawasaki, who was the first Macintosh and evangelist. So it really has to do with kind of making developers excited. So for me, like in thinking about kind of what I have to offer, I really thought about this from that perspective, right? So the way that I really got my start is, I really started traveling to a number of conferences, and speaking, and really being fairly visible. And, because I was sort of a visible person in the industry, I was able to get a number of conversations, one of which included the Gumi Corporation, which at the time was, looking to start a Silicon Valley headquarters for a venture fund, and Gumi Corporation is actually a mobile gaming company based in Tokyo. So they're Japanese guys, but looking to come into Silicon Valley. It turns out that my kind of cultural background, my parents are from Japan. I certainly understand some Japanese, and I have cultural sensitivity, as well as kind of a very intense passion for blockchain technology. So I think we ended up hitting it off, and I ended up joining their fund.
Really cool. What a great story. And one of the things I like about crypto and blockchain is that it is actually not centered in the Valley. A lot of it is in Japan, Korea, and Singapore, and that's where kind of exciting stuff is. So for those of us who are one leg in different cultures, it's a great opportunity to do exciting stuff. Let's talk about 2020, because 2020, I think, is going to be a very exciting place for blockchain and crypto. What do you think?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to do now, especially since we're seeing price action and volatility, is to zoom back, right? So zoom back really far as you can, to really try to understand the foundations of what's happening. And, I think at the very end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023, the world population is going to hit 8 billion, right? So, that's a lot of people. And I think one of the things that seems very clear is it seems that our systems are not really holding up. If you look at Mark Zuckerberg, he doesn't want to run a company called Facebook. So he's become a CEO of Meta, right? And if you look at Jack Dorsey, he doesn't want to run a company called Twitter. He doesn't even want to run a company called Square. He wants to run a company called Block, right? Like, I think Jack is looking for some of that blockchain value, that is sort of this show is about, right? So, to me, this is a pretty seismic shift. And the reason why I think these leading entrepreneurs are kind of moving in this direction is I think they've understood that this kind of, we're at the cusp of a transition between, what some people call Web 2, of which Twitter and Facebook belong, and then, towards something called Web 3, right? So, which I think includes things like Zuckerberg's idea of metaverse, but it also includes things like Jack Dorsey's Bitcoin, and further it includes, lots more things than that. There's a lot of gamification and gaming in there, VR, AR. So there's a lot of ingredients. Some people even say that there's AI in there, but it's clear that there has been a pretty seismic change, and I'm happy to kind of go into more detail.
No, we'll go into details, because you've said a lot of things, and let me tell you, I like to unpack them. So, where do we begin? Well, let's start with the systems that are not holding up. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the issues becomes that trust is the biggest concern and the biggest issue right now. Here's the funny part is people are talking about things like the cost per transaction, right? So people are concerned about things like the electricity cost. Apparently you can drive for 2.5 miles in a Tesla to get the equivalent of about 1 Ethereum transaction under proof of work. Now, obviously, we're heading into the merge where Ethereum will drop in energy consumption by over 99.3%, right? So obviously, in the proof of stake Ethereum 2.0, after the merge, we're going to see really, really dramatically less expensive Ethereum, but the transactions. But I would say that the thing that is most important to try to understand is like, what is happening? And what's happening is that we have a transactional fabric that is essentially managing an adversarial system, right? Where there's no trust, right? So what we've built in blockchain is a fabric for, basically removing the necessity to trust intermediaries, right? So what's failing is actually that we really have used trust, but that there are limits to scaling trust, right? So, centralization has been the trick that we've been using. And with centralization, you get incredibly cheap transactions, you get incredibly fast transactions, but you also get something called rug pulls, all right? And a rug pull is when the central authority does something wrong, right? So, I think right now in the kind of, Me Too world, it seems like centralized authorities are constantly doing wrong things. And I think, and obviously there's a bunch of other social and cultural phenomena, things like, the incident with George Floyd. And so there's a lot of kind of cultural interest in authorities doing wrong things, and I think that's been part of the cultural movement.
So folks loosely use this Web 2, Web 3. I was recently interviewed by NPR reporter who wanted me to define Web 3. And, our discussion very quickly got to that philosophical place. So, Miko, I'm going to put you on the spot. What is your definition of Web 3?
Yeah, so I'm very happy to sort of first off complain about it a little bit. And the reason why I'm complaining about it a little bit is that the web is defined by a set of protocols, right? There was a gentleman by the name of Tim Berners-Lee who developed the World Wide Web, right? And including things like HTTPS, right? And so all of the web protocols have not been versioned. There isn't a Web 2.0, right? And there isn't a Web 3.0. So really, it becomes then sort of a metaphor. And the problem with these kind of metaphors is that they mean many different things to different people. So really, Web 3 and Web 2 don't really have a definition. And in a way, like a lot of pundits, will just fight over what it really means. But to me, the thing that is meaningful is that something significant has happened, right? And I think that what's significant that is happening is we're starting to see mass adoption of blockchain as well as cryptographic assets and NFTs. So we're seeing this kind of mass adoption, which I think is this idea of a web. So are we, in fact, rebuilding what we think of as the internet from the foundation? I do think that we are. And I think we're building systems that have different trust properties, based on blockchain technology. So, will there be a new internet? Will the way we use the internet be unrecognizable in 10 years? I think without a doubt. So, is there, in that sense, is there a Web 3? I think there is. I think there is definitely a huge revolutionary thing happening. Whether you want to call it Web 3 or not, it's up to you.
Okay. Well, you started talking about Bitcoin. So let's talk about Bitcoin. Do you think this will be a year it will underperform or overperform S&P 500?
Well, I think there's no question it will overperform. I mean, that's just my own humble opinion. But for me, we seem to be having bearish price action, but I think that it isn't very parallel to what we saw, in 2017 with this kind of 3-year bearish market, right? So to me, it seems like since we're having such interesting kind of a macroeconomic climate, it seems likely, especially with kind of increases in inflation, that we're going to see outperformance, right? So I think obviously inflation also impacts the S&P. So the question then becomes, well, what will be the difference, right? So for me, I can't really accurately predict the price of Bitcoin on a given day. Anyone who says they can is probably fooling.
I didn't ask you that question.
They're either fooling themselves or they're trying to fool you, but for me, I would say that it just seems very improbable that we would have a protracted bear market. So in a sense, there's two scenarios, the pretty obvious thing for me to say, but Bitcoin will either rebound from where we are, right, and probably achieve a new all-time high, or it will go into a more prolonged dip. But I would say the more prolonged dip, I don't see it possibly lasting even as long as the rest of 2022. So, I see a rebound, so it either dips and then it rebounds strongly, or it kind of reverses in the near future and goes strongly. But I would say that the two long-term prognostications is that it'll continue to go strongly. I think there are risks in that kind of a statement. So I think anyone needs to diversify if they're invested in Bitcoin, because it is there are risks, right? There are risks in I think one of the biggest risks is that there's an ESG agenda. So the environmental sustainability of Bitcoin is not great. Obviously, something like an Ethereum is now replacing the electricity expensive proof of work with the proof of stake. So, I think that those are risks. And then another risk in Bitcoin is obviously there's some regulatory risks, although Senator Loomis is introducing a bill in the Congress, from Wyoming. And it really, I think she's going to treat Bitcoin very well. So, I think we're probably headed to good legislation.
There are a few bills, and we've had a few guests discussing that. So regulatory is definitely a massive, is a massive, let's just say wild card, but sure.
Yes.
In your investor speak, it is a risk. And yes, go back to my beginning of the conversation. This is not investment advice. This is for entertainment purposes only. But I talked about Ethereum a couple of times, and transition to proof of stakes and various ESG concerns with Bitcoin. So between the Bitcoin and Ethereum, who's going to be on top?
Yeah. So here's my thinking on this, right? Which is that they're performing two very foundational roles, right? Which is Bitcoin is performing a role as the most trusted and most secure base asset. So in a sense, Bitcoin acts a little bit like gold, right? And I think that that's pretty exciting as an asset during kind of inflationary time windows, right? So if you think about digital gold and you think about the replacement of gold as sort of a scarce base asset, then, I think as a reserve asset, I think continues to have value. We're going to see some really interesting kind of national commitments to Bitcoin, I predict, in this next year. There's a number of countries that are similar to El Salvador, places like Vietnam, there's Brazil, there's a bunch of places where you could really see very strong use of Bitcoin as a reserve asset, or, even as a national reserve or legal tender, right? So those are kind of Bitcoin use cases. I think Ethereum use case is very, very, very different. It's sort of a novel compute platform, but I think because of DeFi, it's a little less like Amazon AWS and a little bit more like the stock market, So in a sense, Ethereum turns almost into a stock market, which I think is a different use case. Do you
think we're going to see cryptos being kind of more adapted as one payment methods? And do you think we're going to see more innovation in the recovery and sort of management of those assets?
Yeah.
A little bit less awkwardly, maybe not fluidly, but less awkwardly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear to most people that crypto is like a wild, wild west, right? So you go out into this crazy frontier, hope your sharpshooting skills are good because, there's bandits and there's poisonous snakes and, there's all kinds of crazy things in the Wild West, right? But I think what's happening now with mass adoption is we're going to see a kind of a safer crypto, right? So we're going to see kind of a realm that is sort of illuminated by regulation. So for example, like if you see the things that Coinbase are doing, our portfolio company, Celsius Network, is working very closely with regulators. So I think there will be regulated custodians. I think there will be stable assets like USDC that I think will help to kind of pave the way for a much more kind of, I would say, hacker proof and, much more sort of safe region, within this Wild West, right? So I think as the railroads get built, more and more people can settle the Wild West and, maybe make it a little less wild. There probably be continue to be wild areas and have other areas that are not so wild.
Wild areas. Okay, we'll talk about the safe crypto. But you mentioned El Salvador, Vietnam, well-known example, of course, of China, the central bank issuing its digital currencies. Do you think that will be a thing? Do you think we're going to see more central banks, issuing digital currencies, or do you think that will be an isolated sort of experience?
No, I definitely see more CBDC experimentation. I think for sure, I think we're going to see these types of things occurring, right? To me, I look at everything from the perspective of open source, right? So the question becomes, okay, well, so it turns out that there's like an open source operating system, right? And this is called Linux, right? So the question becomes, well, are there proprietary operating systems? Of course there are. There's like iOS for iPhones. Android is partly open, but also partly proprietary. We're seeing things like Windows. Do those continue to exist? Of course they do, right? But for most of kind of internet applications, the back end is open source, right? So what happens naturally is that these kind of open source monies compete with proprietary platforms. Right. So both, I think, continue to exist. And if you look at things like open source software, it turns out that the proprietary software companies are all building on top of open source software. Right. So it turns out that this competition between proprietary and open actually enables the proprietary software companies to be more valuable. Right. So if you look at the total value of the software industry, it's has a higher percentage of open source software than ever before in history, but it's also the highest value in history. So I think what we'll see governments continue to print money, but increasingly use open source money, as for example, El Salvador has done.
Very interesting. I want to go back to that conversation of safe crypto. And in that conversation of safe crypto, you mentioned a couple of things. One, you mentioned the sort of innovation of actually kind of making a safer place. You also mentioned the role of regulations and how companies like Celsius sort of essentially using that, working with regulators as a competitive advantage to invite folks to be part of of what they do. In making crypto, first, it sounds like you think we're going to see much more of that in 22 and after that. Is that kind of a fair summary of what you said?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's inevitable that that there are regulatory agendas associated with things like FATF or things like the Treasury Department, DOJ kind of initiatives, like FinCEN. So, to me, I think the AML agenda is a big part of it. So, a lot of it has to do with creating a zone where people are kind of identifiable, which of course makes absconding with money permanently much harder, right? So I think that there will probably continue to be sort of crypto zones that are less regulated and more wild, and they'll probably become more zones that are well regulated and will be less unsafe. So I think both of these will probably continue to exist.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about stablecoins, because some people see them as sort of an opportunity to diminish that wild factor, the poisonous snake factor, or an easier way to get to the decentralized dream. Just curious, kind of what are your thoughts about stable coins, and what do you think the future in 2022 or after?
Yeah, I see stable coins as being very valuable because they represent almost more idealized payment rails, right? And the reason why they represent good payment systems is obviously when you go back to the history of Bitcoin, you have Laszlo famously having paid 10,000 Bitcoins for, Papa John's pizza. So he paid someone so those are famous, right? And so obviously when you think about something like a reserve asset, like imagine you're holding gold, right? Like, do people use gold to pay for a pizza? They go in, they get a gold bar, and the pizza delivery man, they start like shaving pieces of gold off, and thanks for the pizza.
Sometimes a girl wants to be eccentric, so don't judge, okay?
Yeah. So you go under your bed, you get your gold bar, and you just start shaving off, and it's like, is that enough for the pizza? So it's yeah, but so Bitcoins are not that awesome for payment because, like, obviously you're kind of expecting to hold them as a reserve asset. So just to clarify, reserve asset is what central banks use to buy back their own currency, right? So if their currency becomes too cheap, they have to have the power to buy their currency back, right? So obviously, if you have dollars, right, your reserve asset for dollars can't be dollars because you can't buy a dollar back with a dollar. I mean, if you did, nothing would happen. So so you have to have something else that backs up your dollar, right? So the idea becomes that like Bitcoin is a reserve asset. So the idea that you're spending your reserve asset every day doesn't actually make sense because the goal of a reserve asset is you hold it until you feel like the price of your main asset is actually really bad, right? And if you feel like your dollar is collapsing, then you have to sort of start selling gold or actually buying back your dollar, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that stable coins will really form an ideal payment. One of the news items that popped recently is that PayPal is investigating sort of launching their own stable asset. I think they're already partnered with Paxos, so it seems likely that that's a pretty easy thing for them to do.
Yeah. No, I am with you there. I have to ask you about the meme coins.
Yeah,
we've seen some interesting coins in 21. Are we going to see more of that? Or are we kind of over that? What role do you think that fund played in the evolution, the revolution of the cryptos?
I think it will hopefully be a historical artifact. I think that will continue to exist. But, for example, like if you look at Dogecoin as probably the grandfather of them all, right? But then you saw things like Shiba Inu, right? So you saw these kind of but the funny thing about these coins that are kind of based on dogs is that anyone can make like a wiener dog coin, or they can just keep making more and more. There's a lot of different kind of dogs out there, so they can start going all, So my point is that there's no end to it, right? And so I think there's really the pattern in crypto, I think, should be that you play, right, just to see what happens, right? But then after you play, you should kind of learn. Right. And then once you learn, then you should come back smarter. Right. Because I think if you really think about these kind of meme coins, it's really pure speculation. And I think that, the thing that becomes interesting is that when you look at things like Bitcoin price, they used to call it like tulip mania. Right. Yeah, but what happened historically in tulip mania is the price chart would spike and then it would crash. And then it would basically be a flat line forever. Right? Yeah. That's what tulips looks like, right? Whereas Bitcoin doesn't do that. Or
beanie babies, yes.
Correct. It doesn't do that, right? It keeps kind of going higher, right? So the point is that after a long analysis, you begin to realize that there is value, right? That there's a very powerful value. And one of the things I love to address is there's a really silly phrase called intrinsic value. So it has meaning in economics, but it doesn't have a real meaning. And what I mean by that is nothing really has an intrinsic value. Everything only has a value of a utility. But if I describe Bitcoin as a utility that prevents governments from overprinting money, right? Then so the internet created a reserve bank called Bitcoin, right? And it basically allows people to offset the power of governments. So if you think about the idea that you can now sort of effectively, as an individual, prevent your government from overprinting money, that's pretty amazing. I think that's a really cool thing that you can do now. And so I think that, it has value, and it probably, at the moment, people think it has about $1 trillion worth of value.
Yeah. Well, I love the framework. Play, learn, grow up. I think that was a good way to put it. We're coming to the end. I have a couple more questions. So let me sort of talk about, like, if you were looking forward to 2022, what has worked, what hasn't, what should we do more, or what should we do less?
Yeah, so I think that 2022 promises to be an incredibly experimental year. I think we are seeing a lot of kind of excitement around metaverse. I think one of the things we're looking forward to is the launch of Cambria, which is the next gen Facebook VR headset. I think Apple is kind of hinting at an AR headset that they're putting out. So I think the availability of high quality consumer AR and VR, I think, will be really interesting, and they will kind of push forward the interface for the internet. So I think that as we move into the 2022, I think we're going to see more of a metaverse concept trying to evolve. And I think one of the things that we're seeing quite a lot of is we're seeing a lot of play to earn gaming. So we're seeing new business models involving gaming that I think are going to be, pretty big. I think things that have not worked, I think so far, I think one of the things that happens is that, these kind of waves of price action create these really weird anti-patterns where kind of new investors or new entrants in the space, they kind of buy high because of the hype. And then when it starts to decrease, they start selling low, right? Mm-hmm. So this isn't financial advice, but buying high and selling low isn't how you do it.
This is not advice. This is just basics.
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm trying to say is that, in some ways, some of the hype has kind of created a weird kind of investment environment, So from my perspective, the other day, I on my Twitter, I said that, it's really bad to buy high and sell low. It's probably good to buy when it's low, right? But in some ways, the smartest people that I know actually aren't paying very much attention at all to kind of the prices going up and down, right? So in a way, coming back to this,
they have a long-term kind of view on this industry, and I love that. And I mean, as an investor, I think that's your goal as well. You're very active on YouTube. You have a channel. So as a maybe goodbye to this conversation, tell us more. I'm a fan, but I would love for you to tell the folks what it is, where you can be found, and what is sort of the goal there.
I appreciate it. So my show is Miko Bits, MIKOBITS, Miko Bits. And you can find me on most popular podcast areas as well as on YouTube. Miko.com/bits. And then, what I do there is I really focus on the humans, right? Because I think one of the things that's happening with people investing is they're really just handing money to people they never met. So I feel like at the very least you could do is watch a video and see if this human even seems reasonable, and a lot of crazy people are getting investment, and the investors sometimes don't even have a good feeling for who they are. So, this is really about the people of blockchain, the people of DeFi, people of NFT, people of the metaverse. So, it's very people focused show.
I am a fan. You have a number one fan here. So Miko, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. It has been my dream to talk to you, and my dream came true in 2022, right in the beginning. So it must be a good year for all of us, right?
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining. We'll continue having more conversation about blockchain value. That is the one prediction that I know for sure will come true. And so thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.